February 18th, 2001 looked like any other Daytona Sunday. Bright Florida light on asphalt, the grandstand alive, the engines turning anticipation into vibration. The Daytona 500 was never just a race. It was the race, and Dale Earnhardt was never just another driver. He carried the black number 3 like a warning and a promise, a man whose presence could change the way an entire pack behaved. By 2001, he had already built a legacy, yet he still showed up because this year was not only about him. Michael Waltrip and his son Dale Earnhardt Jr. had a real shot at winning, and Earnhardt took on the role of protector, trading personal glory for their clean path to the finish. As the laps ran down, the air became crowded with tension. Cars ran nose to tail, each driver reading tiny shifts of momentum, each decision made at a speed where thought and instinct blur together. Earnhardt held third place, steady and controlled, doing the hard work of defense. Sterling Marlin was close behind, and at Daytona, that closeness is the design of the competition. On the final lap, the margin disappeared. There was a light touch, a moment so small that it would have been forgotten in most races. Then the number 3 car broke loose, angled toward the outside wall, and the sequence became irreversible. Ken Schrader was caught in the chain of movement, and both cars slammed into the barrier near turn 4. From many angles, it did not look like the kind of impact that should end a life. But inside the cockpit, the reality was brutal. The car went from high speed to near zero in a fraction of a second, and the forces drove through the body faster than it could absorb them. Earnhardt suffered a fatal basilar skull fracture, an injury linked to violent deceleration and the whip of the head and neck. At that time, advanced head and neck restraint systems were not yet required in the series, and the barriers and interior safety standards had not reached what later generations would consider normal. In the moments after the impact, confusion spread before certainty. Schrader climbed out and ran back toward Earnhardt, and the way he stopped and looked and told people this was different. Rescue crews arrived quickly and worked with urgency, but urgency could not change what the impact had already decided. A sport built on noise fell into silence, and the checkered flag still waved as grief moved through the speedway. Almost immediately, grief searched for a target, and the closest name to the moment became Sterling Marlin. People demanded certainty and blame, a simple villain for a complex reality. The sanctioning body described the contact as a racing incident, the kind of split-second interaction that happens in the front pack every season, but public anger does not fade on command. For Marlin, the crash became a lifelong shadow, not only because he was there, but because he survived. He faced accusations, threats, and isolation, and he chose silence rather than turning a family's worst day into a public argument. Years later, when he reflects on that afternoon, what lingers is not a hidden twist, but the emotional arithmetic of replaying 1 second in the mind, again and again, asking what could have changed if the line had been a foot wider or the timing a breath different. For fans, he was more than statistics. He was the stubborn heartbeat of a sport that prized toughness, the driver who turned pressure into presence and fear into fuel. His rivals respected him even when they hated racing near him, because he never asked for space, he took it. That is why the images from Turn 4 did not just shock people. They broke a shared belief that the heroes always climb out alive. The truth that holds is painfully plain. Dale Earnhardt died while doing what he had always done, racing hard and protecting his people, trusting a sport that had not yet fully protected him. And the moment that looked ordinary from far away became the moment that forced stock car racing to confront the true cost of speed. In the seconds after the impact, the track kept moving the way it always did. Cars finished the lap, the race concluded, cameras searched for celebration because that is what sports broadcasts are trained to find. Yet a different signal was already spreading through the people closest to the wreck, a quiet, wordless recognition that something was wrong in a way it rarely is. When Ken Schrader climbed out and hurried back toward the black number 3, his body language told the story before any official statement could. He leaned in, looked inside, and froze. For seasoned drivers, a bad crash usually means bent metal, smoke, maybe a shaken driver with a dazed walk. This was different. Rescue personnel converged quickly, hands moving with rehearsed urgency. But the violence of high-speed deceleration leaves no margin for rescue when the injury is instantly fatal. Around the speedway, the sound drained out. People who had been screaming for a winner only moments earlier began to understand that the sport had just lost its most famous heartbeat. The shock did not arrive like a wave. It arrived like a sudden loss of gravity, the feeling that the world has shifted and the mind is trying to catch up. Earnhardt had felt permanent. He had survived wrecks, controversies, rivalries, decades of pressure, and he had worn every hit as if it were proof of invincibility. Seeing the number 3 stopped and surrounded did not fit the story NASCAR had been telling itself about toughness and luck. When the announcement came, it landed with a blunt finality that left no room for interpretation. Dale Earnhardt was gone. The immediate grief was honest and massive, but grief rarely stays alone. It looks for a shape to hold, a name to blame, a reason that feels simple enough to carry. In the days after Daytona, many fans could not accept that a driver could die from a crash that looked, to the untrained eye, not that bad. That misunderstanding created a vacuum, and the vacuum filled with anger. Sterling Marlin became the most convenient answer because he was the last car near the number 3 before the spin, and because the mind wants a single cause for a tragedy that actually has several. Headlines circled around the same question. Was he responsible? Did he cause it? Could he have avoided it? The problem with those questions is that they treat stock car racing like a courtroom, not like a system. Daytona is a place where cars move in a tight aerodynamic draft, inches apart, and tiny contacts happen because the design of the race encourages closeness. In most cases, that contact results in a wobble, a correction, and the pack keeps going. On that day, the contact occurred in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong angles, and the chain reaction wrote a different ending. NASCAR reviewed what happened and described it as a racing incident, the type that can occur when drivers are running nose to tail at high speed. But an official explanation does not dissolve public emotion, especially when the person who died was a symbol to millions. Marlin received hostility that went far beyond criticism. He faced hate mail and threats. He faced strangers who wanted him to carry their pain. Even if a driver tells himself the truth, that it was not intentional and not something he could control once the physics took over, it is difficult to sleep when the world keeps replaying the same few frames and attaching your name to a death. The loneliness of being blamed is a second crash, one that keeps hitting. What complicates the story further is that the real causes were less dramatic but more important. The fatal injury was not the touch itself. It was the combination of a high-speed impact, sudden deceleration, and the limitations of safety technology and standards at the time. In 2001, the sport was in transition but not yet transformed. Advanced head and neck restraints were still debated rather than universally adopted. Some drivers did not like how those devices felt. Some believed they limited mobility. Some simply trusted what had always worked, because racing culture has long rewarded risk tolerance and punished anything that feels like hesitation. Safety is rarely rejected because people love danger. It is often delayed because change feels unnecessary until the day it becomes the only thing that matters. Earnhardt's death forced NASCAR to confront that reality in the harshest possible way. The questions stopped being theoretical. They became urgent. What can be changed now, immediately, so this does not happen again? That urgency moved through the garages, the sanctioning body, and the broader industry, and it produced reforms that would reshape the sport's safety identity. Over time, head and neck restraint systems became normalized, then expected, then mandatory. Barriers evolved from unforgiving surfaces to energy-absorbing designs meant to reduce the violence transmitted to the driver. Seat and belt standards tightened. Data collection improved so that forces could be measured, studied, and used to redesign cars rather than relying on intuition and tradition. The car itself became less a machine for speed alone and more a protective structure built to manage impact, distribute energy, and preserve the human inside. None of these changes could bring Earnhardt back, and that is the cruel logic of safety reform. It often arrives as a response, not a prevention, because systems resist expensive upgrades until catastrophe proves the cost of delay. For the sport, this meant living with a permanent scar and a permanent responsibility. For Sterling Marlin, it meant carrying a story that never truly belonged to him but would always be attached to his name. He chose not to fight in public. Some people interpreted that silence as guilt, but there is another reading that fits the human reality. Silence can be respect. Silence can be restraint. Silence can be the only way to avoid turning someone else's grief into your own public defense campaign. In a world that demands constant statements, silence can also be a private prison because it leaves the person blamed with nowhere to place the weight except inside his own mind. Years later, when Marlin finally speaks more openly, the most powerful part is not a shocking secret. It is the simple admission of what it feels like to live with a moment you cannot undo. The crash did not only change NASCAR. It changed how every driver thought about the thin line between bravery and vulnerability. It changed how fans understood what they were watching when they watched speed. It changed the definition of what it means to protect a teammate, because Earnhardt died performing that exact duty. And it created a new kind of legacy, one that is not only measured in wins, trophies, or fame, but in the lives saved afterward because the sport was forced to evolve. In the weeks after Daytona, NASCAR faced a problem bigger than any single race result. The sport had always been built on speed, risk, and a certain mythology of toughness. Drivers were celebrated for climbing out of wrecks, brushing off bruises, and getting back into the car as if pain were just another part of the uniform. That mythology was powerful, but it was also fragile because it depended on an assumption that the worst rarely happens. Dale Earnhardt's death shattered that assumption on live television. And once something like that happens in front of millions, you cannot go back to the old story. You can only decide what the new story will be. For a while, grief dominated everything. Fans gathered at tracks with candles and number 3 flags. Radio shows, newspapers, and early internet forums overflowed with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. Many people demanded simple answers. And when the answers were not simple, they tried to simplify them anyway. That is where the backlash against Sterling Marlin took on its own life. The public wanted a person to point at, because pointing at a person feels like control. Blaming systems or standards feels abstract, and abstraction does not satisfy grief. Yet inside the garages, among the people who actually race, the conversation was different. Drivers understood the truth most fans did not want to hear. Racing incidents happen constantly. At superspeedways, the difference between a harmless wiggle and a fatal impact could be a few degrees of angle, a few feet of line, a few milliseconds of timing. They knew Marlin did not wake up that morning with an intention to harm anyone. And they also knew another hard truth. If Dale Earnhardt could die in a crash that did not appear catastrophic, then anyone could. That realization moved quietly but forcefully through the sport. Suddenly, safety was not a debate for engineers and officials alone. It was personal. It was immediate. It was a matter of who would go home to their family after the next race. Still, there was resistance because there is always resistance. In every high-risk profession, people develop habits and beliefs that help them function under pressure. Drivers rely on feel. They rely on familiarity. They rely on the idea that they can manage danger through skill and courage. Safety equipment can be perceived unfairly as an admission of fear or weakness, or as an obstacle to performance. That culture did not begin with NASCAR, and it does not end with it, but after 2001 it could no longer be allowed to decide policy. The sport began to move, sometimes quickly, sometimes painfully, toward modern safety standards. This process was not just a list of new rules. It was a shift in identity. NASCAR had to learn to say, out loud, that bravery is not the absence of protection. Bravery is showing up and demanding that the system protect the people who make the show possible. The investigation into Earnhardt's death focused attention on details that most fans had never considered. How belts fit, how seats were mounted, how the head moves when the body is restrained, how the angle of impact changes the forces delivered to the driver, how walls can be designed to absorb energy rather than reflect it back into a vehicle. In the public imagination, a crash is one event, a single violent moment. In reality, a crash is a chain of physics decisions. The car's structure, the restraint system, the seat, the helmet, the barrier, the speed, the angle, the deceleration. If any link in that chain fails, the consequences can be fatal. Earnhardt's death drew brutal attention to the link that mattered most: head and neck trauma and high deceleration impacts. Basilar skull fracture had been a known risk in motorsports, but knowledge does not automatically produce enforcement. After Daytona, it became impossible to ignore. The sport's response was to reduce the probability that the head and neck would experience lethal forces in similar crashes through improved restraints and changes to track barriers and car design. From the outside, these developments can sound technical, like engineering notes. But inside the sport, they were emotional because every new requirement came with a memory attached. Every time a driver clipped into a restraint system that had once been optional, he was touching the legacy of the man who died without it being mandatory. Every time a car hit a safer barrier and the driver walked away, that survival became a quiet tribute to the lesson bought at an unbearable price. This is where the story becomes bigger than one crash and bigger than one man's grief. Dale Earnhardt's death did not only take something from NASCAR. It forced NASCAR to give something back, a commitment to protecting the next generation. In that sense, tragedy became a catalyst, not a justification, not a romantic ending, but a catalyst that made reforms politically and culturally possible. Before 2001, some improvements could be delayed by tradition, cost, or the slow pace of consensus. After 2001, delay looked like negligence. The sport's leadership had to act. Drivers had to accept change. Teams had to invest. Tracks had to adapt. Sponsors and broadcasters, who benefit from the spectacle, could no longer pretend safety was not their business. Even the language of the sport began to shift. Safety stopped being something you talked about only after an accident. It became something you discussed as a requirement for competing. While the system moved, Sterling Marlin lived inside a different timeline, one that did not offer the satisfaction of progress. Rules can change. Barriers can be redesigned. Cars can evolve. But a driver's memory does not upgrade so easily. For him, the last lap of the 2001 Daytona 500 did not become a historical chapter. It stayed like a loop that could start at any moment, in the quiet of a hotel room, in the sound of engines at a later race, in a random television clip that appears without warning. People often misunderstand what blame does to the person blamed. It does not feel like punishment and then release. It feels like a constant negotiation with reality. You know what you intended. You know what you did and did not do. You know what the official conclusions say. Yet you also live in a world where strangers believe you killed a legend. You can correct them, but correction rarely beats emotion. You can argue, but arguing can look like disrespect to the family. So you choose silence, and the silence becomes both shield and burden. Over time, Marlin's silence took on meaning because it contrasted with the noise around him. In a media environment that rewards outrage, he refused to perform. He did not build a public defense empire. He did not turn the tragedy into a brand. He returned to racing, carried the weight privately, and relied on the support of those who understood the sport's reality. That support mattered because it drew a boundary between what fans wanted to believe and what racers knew to be true. It reminded the public that competition is not the same as malice. And it reminded the sport that its responsibility is not only to entertain, but to protect the people who create that entertainment. Meanwhile, Dale Earnhardt's legacy continued to expand in a way that is rare and complex. Many champions are remembered for what they won. Earnhardt is remembered for what he represented: raw competitiveness, loyalty to his people, a willingness to play the role the team needed, even when it meant sacrificing his own finish. That last lap is a painful proof of that loyalty. He was not chasing the win for himself. He was defending the win for his teammate and his son. In motorsports, where individual glory often dominates, that choice turned him into something more than a champion. It made him a symbol of what racing culture calls family. And because his death forced the sport into reforms that saved lives later, he also became, tragically, part of the safety story that defines modern NASCAR. The next time a driver walks away from a crash that once might have been fatal, the sport is witnessing the practical side of Earnhardt's legacy, a legacy written not only in trophies but in survival. By the time 2 decades had passed, the Daytona 500 of 2001 had stopped being a single event and turned into a permanent reference point. In NASCAR, people measure eras by what happened before and after that day. Cars looked different. Tracks felt different. The safety culture was different. Yet for the fans who lived through it, the memory never truly aged. It stayed sharp, replayed each February, carried in the quiet rituals that follow tragedy. Tributes, documentaries, arguments, and that one unavoidable question. How could a crash that looked so ordinary be so final? That question is where the story of Sterling Marlin becomes more complicated than a headline. He was not the villain that grief demanded. He was a competitor who happened to be nearest to history's turning point. And in a sport where milliseconds decide legacies, being nearest can be a lifetime sentence. Public anger is rarely precise. It does not distinguish between causation and proximity. It sees a touch, it sees a spin, and it reaches for a conclusion. Marlin carried that conclusion for years, not because the facts proved it, but because emotions repeated it. The people who understand racing understood that contact happens, that it is part of the ecosystem of drafting, that it is often unintentional, and that the difference between survival and death can come down to safety standards more than any single steering input. But the broader audience was not living in that ecosystem. They were living in the shock of losing a symbol, and symbols often demand a scapegoat when they fall. What Marlin did next is the part of the story that matters if you want this narrative to feel human instead of sensational. He did not go on a media tour to fight the public. He did not posture. He did not turn the tragedy into a courtroom drama where he could win. Instead, he retreated into a more private reality, a decision that many misread. Silence can look like admission to people who want a confession. Silence can look like weakness to people who want to fight. But silence can also be a choice rooted in respect. Marlin had raced with Earnhardt, battled him, understood his influence, and knew the family was processing a loss that could not be negotiated. Any public defense from Marlin risked making the story about him when, in the minds of many, it should remain about Dale. So he stayed quiet. He kept his head down. And that choice, while honorable in one sense, came with a hidden cost. Silence does not stop the mind from replaying the moment. It only means you replay it alone. The internal life of a driver after a fatal crash nearby is not the same as the external life fans see. On television, the sport moves on quickly because the schedule demands it. The next race comes, then the next season, and the machine keeps going. But inside a driver, a fatal incident becomes a personal archive. The sound of air shifting in the draft, the slight change in a steering wheel, the way the car moved after contact, the angle of the wall, the glance of another driver, the sudden stillness afterward. These details live without invitation. They return in quiet moments at night, in a half-second before sleep, or in the middle of a normal day when something triggers the memory. The mind does not process trauma like a news cycle. It processes trauma like a loop. That is why Marlin's later comments, when he finally offered more reflection, were never going to be about a dramatic twist. They were about carrying a weight, about wanting to go back and change physics, change angles, change that last touch, even while knowing the logical truth. In that environment, at that speed, with the standards of that era, the margin was always thin. Racing teaches drivers to accept risk, but acceptance is not the same as peace. You can accept that accidents happen and still feel haunted by being present at the worst one. The other dimension of this story, the one that gives it broader meaning, is how NASCAR itself changed its relationship with responsibility. Earnhardt's death forced the sport into a new kind of honesty. It had to admit that tradition is not an argument against improvement. It had to admit that fans do not want only courage. They also want the people they admire to survive. That is why reforms came and why they stayed. Over time, the safety upgrades stopped feeling like new rules and started feeling like the baseline. A younger generation entered the sport with a different attitude. They grew up seeing head and neck restraint systems as normal. They grew up racing in cars designed with survival in mind from the earliest engineering stage. They grew up with barriers that were built to absorb energy, not return it. To them, the world before 2001 can feel almost unbelievable. But it was real, and it was the world Earnhardt lived in. In that sense, Dale's death became a dividing line between two eras of racing culture. One era treated danger as proof of authenticity. The next era treated safety as proof of maturity. Yet even with that progress, the emotional story remains unfinished because progress does not erase the human consequences. Dale Earnhardt's family lived with an absence that no reform can repair. Dale Jr. carried not only a famous name, but a specific kind of pressure, the expectation to represent a legacy while also carrying private grief. Fans carried a collective wound because Earnhardt was not only a driver, he was part of their identity, part of their weekends, part of their language. And Sterling Marlin carried the strangest burden of all, being attached to the final seconds of a legend's life, even though he did not choose that role. When you tell the story well, you do not treat it as a mystery that was finally solved. You treat it as a tragedy that reveals how humans react under stress, how fans seek answers, how media frames narratives, how systems resist change until forced, and how individuals endure blame that is not fully theirs. In the end, the most honest conclusion is not that one person revealed a secret. It is that time revealed a lesson. Speed is thrilling, but it is indifferent. Physics does not care who is famous. The only way to honor the people who risk their lives for the sport is to build a system that makes survival more likely. That is what NASCAR learned the hard way at Daytona, and that is why the number 3 remains more than a number. It is a memory, a warning, and a legacy that continues every time a driver walks away from a crash that once would have ended differently. When people say the sport changed that day, they usually mean the rules, the equipment, the barriers, the research, the engineering. All of that is true. But the deeper change happened in the psychology of everyone who touched NASCAR, from drivers and crews to broadcasters and fans. Before 2001, danger was treated like a familiar companion, something everyone acknowledged but rarely confronted directly. After 2001, danger became a headline, a fact that demanded action, not just acceptance. That shift altered the way races were watched. It altered the way impacts were described. It altered what the public expected from NASCAR leadership, and it altered what drivers demanded from the system that asked them to risk everything for entertainment. In that new environment, Sterling Marlin's experience became a quiet case study in how tragedy assigns roles to people who never asked for them. The public wanted a story with clear characters, a hero, a villain, and a lesson wrapped in a single explanation. Reality did not cooperate. Reality offered something more painful, a chain of factors that converged in one irreversible moment. In such cases, the human brain still tries to simplify because complexity feels like helplessness. So fans fix their gaze on Marlin. The fact that NASCAR described the contact as a routine racing incident did not satisfy those who needed the world to make moral sense. If a legend died, someone must be morally responsible, not only technically involved. That is how grief transforms into accusation. What is often overlooked is that Marlin's identity within the sport before Daytona was not built on recklessness or malice. He was respected, competitive, and steady, the type of driver who could win big races and earn trust in the garage. After Daytona, none of that mattered to the loudest voices. A single clip reduced a full career to one touch. That reduction is one of the cruelest things public narratives can do, because it strips a person of context and replaces it with a single moment. Marlin could have chosen the modern path. Constant interviews, public relations management, aggressive defense, a campaign to reframe the story. Instead, he stayed mostly out of the spotlight. The choice reads differently depending on what you want to believe. If you want him guilty, silence looks like guilt. If you understand racing, silence looks like restraint. If you understand human pain, silence can look like a man trying not to add noise to a family's tragedy. And if you understand trauma, silence looks like survival, because sometimes speaking keeps the wound open. Over time, however, silence has a way of hardening into a myth. People fill the gaps with their own assumptions. That is why later reflections, when Marlin finally speaks more directly about the psychological burden, matter. Not because they unlock a hidden conspiracy, but because they restore the missing human layer. He was there. He lived it. He absorbed blame. He carried the replay in his head. And he still had to show up at tracks, put on a helmet, and race under the same sky, in the same kind of pack, knowing the crowd could be both audience and jury. Racing, in that sense, became a test of internal endurance. Not only the endurance of engines and tires, but the endurance of a mind under pressure. For many drivers, the hardest part of high-level competition is not fear of crashing. It is fear of being defined by a crash, fear of becoming a permanent footnote in someone else's tragedy. Marlin became exactly that footnote in the eyes of the public, and that is a heavy way to live. Yet the NASCAR community, the people inside the sport, understood something that outsiders often miss. Competitors can be fierce on track and still be bound by a deep respect for each other's humanity. Drivers share a risk that outsiders can admire but rarely feel. They know the line between control and chaos is thin. They know the difference between intent and outcome. That is why many defended Marlin, not out of politics, but out of recognition. If the sport turned him into a villain for an accident, it could turn any of them into a villain tomorrow. That solidarity did not erase Marlin's burden, but gave him something crucial, a place where the truth of racing still mattered. While Marlin carried his private weight, NASCAR's public identity had to evolve. The sport could not simply mourn and move on. It had to demonstrate learning. That learning came through visible changes, but also through a new kind of message, that safety is not a compromise of authenticity. It is part of professionalism. The reforms after 2001 created a feedback loop. Better restraints and safer barriers reduced fatal outcomes. Reduced fatal outcomes strengthened public trust. Stronger trust allowed NASCAR to invest further in safety without fans accusing it of softening the sport. Over time, safety improvements became part of NASCAR's credibility. They allowed the sport to say, with evidence, that it was not ignoring lessons written in blood. This is where Dale Earnhardt's legacy expands beyond wins. People remember champions for trophies. Earnhardt is remembered because his final race became a turning point that likely saved lives afterward. That is a tragic form of influence, but it is influence all the same. Every time a driver walks away from a high-speed crash, a portion of that survival belongs to the reforms accelerated by 2001. The sport does not like to say it this way, because it feels too direct, too harsh. But the logic is unavoidable. Earnhardt's death forced the system to protect others more effectively. In that sense, his legacy is built into the modern structure of NASCAR, embedded in belts, seats, barriers, protocols, and expectations. For fans, the emotional relationship with Earnhardt remains intense because he represented more than a driver archetype. He represented a worldview, toughness, competitiveness, loyalty, and a refusal to back down. He was the Intimidator, but he was also the man who could sacrifice his own finish to protect his teammate and his son. That combination of ferocity and loyalty is why his absence still feels personal to so many. And it is why the story of that day must be handled with care. If you turn it into a sensational, secret reveal, you cheapen the complexity. If you turn it into a simplistic blame story, you distort reality. The strongest telling is the honest one. A tragedy born from speed, timing, and imperfect safety. A community forced to change. A family forced to grieve. A driver forced to live with proximity. And a sport that learned, painfully, that legends are not protected by reputation. They are protected by systems, and systems only improve when people refuse to accept preventable loss as the price of entertainment. When Sterling Marlin is described as finally speaking, the phrase suggests a dramatic confession, as if the truth had been locked away behind his silence. But the deeper reality is more restrained and more human. Time does not turn accidents into mysteries. Time simply changes what people are ready to hear. In the first days after Daytona, the sport was raw. The Earnhardt family was shattered. Fans were in mourning and looking for someone to blame. Any public discussion from Marlin, no matter how carefully phrased, would have been poured into that emotional fire. Silence, in that moment, was not an escape from truth. It was an attempt to avoid making the tragedy louder. Years later, when he looks back, the meaning of his silence becomes clearer. He was trying to protect the people already drowning in grief, and he was trying to protect himself from saying something that could never be taken back. In a sport where every word can become a headline, restraint is sometimes the only responsible choice. Still, restraint does not spare you from consequence. Living quietly does not stop strangers from assigning guilt. It does not stop the crash from replaying in your mind. It does not stop the uncomfortable feeling that your name will always be stitched into a moment you would erase if you could. When Marlin reflects on that day, the most believable emotions are not shock and anger, but exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying the same memory for years, from answering the same question in different forms, from hearing your name spoken in the same sentence as someone else's death, again and again. He can say, it was an accident, and it can be true, and yet the truth can still feel insufficient, because truth does not heal the people who want a different ending. That is the hardest part of accidents in public life. Even when there is no wrongdoing, there is still damage, and the damage still attaches to someone. In Marlin's case, the attachment was almost automatic. He was the nearest car. His bumper touched Earnhardt's. Cameras captured the sequence. Fans needed a clear line of cause and effect. The fact that racing incidents are often the result of shared air, tiny movements, and split-second decisions at extreme speed did not fit the emotional need for a single culprit. So the story simplified itself into blame, and Marlin became the name that absorbed it. Yet if you move away from emotion and toward the mechanics, the conclusion becomes stark. The touch did not kill Dale Earnhardt. The fatal outcome came from the forces of the impact and the limitations of the safety environment in that era. The crash did not look catastrophic to many viewers because stock cars are built to take visible damage and keep the cabin relatively intact, at least in appearance. But appearance can be misleading. A car can look not too bad and still deliver lethal deceleration to the body. That is why the true lesson is not about a single driver's action. It is about the gap between what people see and what physics does. That gap was exposed at Daytona, and once it was exposed, NASCAR could not ignore it. The sport had to reconcile its public image with the responsibility of protecting its participants. That reconciliation changed NASCAR in ways that are still visible today. The improvements were not cosmetic. They were structural. Head and neck restraint systems became standard and then mandatory. Seat and belt protocols tightened. Car design moved toward better energy management. Tracks invested in barriers designed to absorb and dissipate energy. Medical response systems evolved. Data analysis became more central. What matters is not just that these changes happened, but that they became part of the sport's identity rather than an uncomfortable add-on. In earlier eras, safety could be treated like a secondary concern, a necessary cost, but not a defining value. After 2001, safety became a central obligation, and that obligation created a different kind of legacy for Earnhardt. His fans will always remember the wins, the championships, the black number 3, the swagger, the refusal to yield. But the sport also remembers him through policy, engineering, and survival. Every time a driver walks away from a crash that once might have ended differently, the sport is seeing the living proof of what it learned. This is where Marlin's reflections, even if simple, carry weight. When he says the best way to honor Dale is to make the sport safer, he is not offering a convenient moral. He is describing the only form of redemption that a system can provide after an irreversible loss. No apology can rewrite the past. No explanation can satisfy every fan. But reforms can protect the next driver. They can reduce the chance that another family experiences the same phone call, the same empty seat at the table, the same sudden end of a life that felt permanent. That is why the most responsible way to tell this story is to keep the focus on transformation rather than accusation. It is tempting to frame everything as scandal and confession, because scandal captures attention. But the real power of this tragedy is not scandal. It is consequence. A sport confronted its own vulnerability. A community lived through public grief. A driver lived through public blame. And out of that collision between emotion and reality, NASCAR became safer, more modern, and more honest about what it asks of the people who race. If Marlin's voice sounds quiet in retelling, that quietness is fitting. Loudness is easy. Quietness suggests the presence of something that still hurts. And in the shadow of Daytona, the truth is not a secret. The truth is a memory, a lesson, and a responsibility that continues every time engines rise and the pack enters turn 4. More than 20 years later, the Daytona 500 of 2001 still sits at the center of NASCAR's emotional map. It is remembered not only because it ended a legend's life, but because it forced everyone in the sport to confront a truth they had lived around for decades. Speed will always demand a price, and the only ethical question is whether that price includes avoidable loss. Dale Earnhardt's death made that question impossible to ignore. It turned safety from a background issue into a defining responsibility. It turned one man's final lap into a permanent lesson written into every rulebook, every barrier system, and every restraint a driver clicks into before the green flag waves. And it left behind a kind of legacy that is both painful and powerful, because it is measured not only in memory, but in survival. If you ask fans why Earnhardt still matters, they often start with the obvious. 7 championships, the iconic black number 3, the fearless style that made rivals tense whenever he was in the mirror. They talk about the Intimidator as if he were a natural force, something you couldn't bargain with, only respect. But when the conversation deepens, fans talk about something else too. They talk about the way Earnhardt raced for his people, the way he could be ruthless as a competitor and loyal as a teammate, the way he was willing, in that final race, to protect Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. rather than chase the win for himself. That detail matters because it reframes the tragedy. He did not die reaching for personal glory. He died performing a role that was rooted in loyalty and team purpose. And that fact is why the grief felt so personal to so many. It wasn't just that a champion died. It was that a man died while trying to deliver a win to others. In sports, there is something especially haunting about sacrifice that was never intended to be fatal. In the years after, Dale Jr. carried the most complicated inheritance in racing, a famous name tied to an empty place where a father should have been. He kept racing, kept showing up, kept learning how to be his own person while the world looked at him as a continuation of the number 3 story. That pressure could have crushed him. Instead, he built his own identity, and in doing so, he became one of the most visible examples of resilience in the sport. For many fans, Dale Jr. became part of the healing process, a reminder that legacy can continue without pretending the loss never happened. Meanwhile, NASCAR's next generations benefited from an uncomfortable truth. Their safety was built on someone else's tragedy. Many drivers who came after have spoken, directly or indirectly, through gratitude for modern protections. They know that safer barriers, better restraint systems, and improved car design are not abstract technology upgrades. They are the difference between walking away and not walking away. That is why Earnhardt's influence still sits in the sport's bloodstream. Every crash that ends with a driver stepping out, waving, and climbing into an ambulance only as a precaution is a quiet echo of the reforms that accelerated after 2001. In that sense, Earnhardt's legacy is not just emotional. It is operational. It is present in the systems that now prevent a similar impact from becoming automatically fatal. Yet no amount of progress removes the human layer of this story. Sterling Marlin's life remains intertwined with that day, not because he was a villain, but because he was near the moment history turned. He is a reminder that tragedy can assign roles without fairness, that being close to an accident can become a lifelong label, that public narratives can punish proximity as if it were intent. If Marlin's reflections sound simple, if he speaks about accidents, about regret, about wanting the sport to be safer, those words may not satisfy people who want a dramatic confession. But maybe they're not meant to satisfy that hunger. Maybe they are meant to do something more honest, to acknowledge the reality that sometimes the deepest truth is not exciting. Sometimes the deepest truth is that human beings live with what happened, and the only relief comes from ensuring it helps prevent another loss. This is why the final message of this story should not be blame. It should be perspective. NASCAR is still a dangerous sport, and it always will be, because the core of racing is speed pushed to the edge of control. But danger does not have to mean neglect. Earnhardt's death forced a shift from fatalism to responsibility. It proved that courage is not diminished by safety. Courage is preserved by it, because a driver who survives can race again, can return home, can keep living the life that speed demands. When fans honor Dale Earnhardt, they honor the memories, the battles, the wins, the aura of the number 3. But they also honor something quieter, the transformation that followed, the insistence that the sport learn, the refusal to accept preventable death as entertainment's cost, the legacy that lives in every safer lap turned at Daytona. In the end, the most respectful way to frame the story is to hold two truths at once. The tragedy will always hurt because it ended a life and changed a family forever. And the tragedy also produced meaning because it made the sport safer for thousands of people who came after. That meaning does not erase pain. It does not justify loss. But it does offer a form of honor that racing understands better than anyone. If you cannot change what happened, you build something stronger from it, and you carry the legend forward, not only in memory, but in the lives you protect.